I'm 66 years old now, and the truth sits heavier on my chest than any winter I survived in these mountains. Back then, in 1993, I still believed science could explain everything, even the strange footprints that turned veteran trackers pale. I remember the cold that night, how it clung to my coat like a warning, how the snowflakes hissed against the rifle barrels of the agents beside me. We walked through a silence so complete it felt alive, and every few steps I wondered why my pulse beat with something more than fear. When we finally found the creature unconscious among shattered branches, I felt the world tilt, as if destiny had reached out and taken my shoulder. They bound the creature with tranquilizer cuffs, but even sedated, its size unsettled everyone. I walked beside the transport cradle, watching vapor rise from its fur in the moonlight, and for reasons I still cannot name, I felt an ache beneath my ribs. In the facility miles away, fluorescent lights hummed like insects, and the smell of antiseptic clashed with the forest still clinging to him. The others called a specimen, but I saw bruises on its arms shaped like human mistakes, not animal violence. When his eyes opened for the first time inside that steel containment room, they didn't flash with rage. They shimmered with confusion, grief, and something strangely familiar. Something almost like recognition. She arrived the next morning, a behavioral agent the Bureau trusted with delicate minds, though no briefing could have prepared her for his. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who has spent years studying broken things and learning how to piece them together without leaving new fractures behind. When she stepped into the observation hall, the creature lifted his head, and the sudden stillness in the room made my breath falter. She spoke softly, introducing herself not as an interrogator but as a listener, and though he couldn't understand her words, he seemed to understand her intention. I saw his shoulders ease, just slightly, as if he sensed that among all of us, she alone meant no harm. In the days that followed, I watched their strained conversations unfold through tempered glass. She would ask gentle questions, letting her voice rise and fall with patience, while he responded with gestures that surprised even the hardened agents monitoring the feeds. Once, when she placed her hand flat against the barrier, he mirrored the gesture, his palm dwarfing hers, and though several inches of reinforced material separated them, the air felt charged with something ancient. I began to wonder whether he remembered voices like hers from some distant lineage, or whether loneliness had carved its way so deep into him that any kindness felt like salvation. Each passing hour made it harder to pretend this was merely research. But the director saw danger where she saw possibility. He reminded us daily that the creature's strength could turn fatal in a blink, that sentimentality had no place in the sterile corridors of federal containment. I nodded along. Yet every time I reviewed the footage, I noticed small details. How the creature's breathing slowed when she entered, how his gaze softened, how he angled his body to appear less imposing. These were not signs of aggression. They were signs of longing, signs of mind reaching across an abyss for the only warmth it recognized. Even so, the director's warnings planted seeds of dread in me, whispering that trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered. One evening, a storm rolled across the valley, rattling the facility's metal panels like tin toys. Thunder cracked, and the creature recoiled, emitting a low, pained rumble that vibrated through the floor. Before any of us could react, she stepped forward, speaking his name, not an official designation, but the gentle syllables she'd begun to use when the cameras weren't recording. He quieted instantly, eyes fixing on her like a frightened child recognizing a familiar lullaby. Watching them, I felt something tighten around my heart, a mix of awe and fear, because I knew bonds formed under duress could become unbreakable, even dangerous, when threatened. In the quiet after the storm, I lingered outside the observation chamber, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing and the softer cadence of hers, as she reassured him. It struck me then that their connection wasn't an aberration. It was a response to isolation, to captivity, to the simple human need for solace reflected in a creature who had never known gentleness from our kind. I realized I was no longer an impartial observer. I was becoming a witness to something forbidden, something the agency would never tolerate. And yet, as I watched him settle into uneasy sleep, I felt a growing certainty that he was beginning to trust him more deeply than any of us understood. I should have reported it that night. Should have gone straight to the director with my suspicions, but something in me resisted. Maybe it was the way she stood beside the glass, shoulders trembling slightly as she watched him sleep, or maybe it was a realization that I had grown protective of them both, as if their fragile bond offered a glimpse of humanity we had forgotten. The air smelled of damp metal and ozone from the storm, and the corridor lights flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. I felt the truth rising inside me, unwelcome and undeniable. He wasn't merely responding to her kindness. He was drawn to her, tethered by something deeper than fear. And she, despite her professionalism, lingered too long and cared. As I turned to leave, the creature's eyes snapped open, reflecting the light with startling clarity, and for the first time, he looked past her and directly at me, as if he knew I held the power to break the bond between them. His gaze pinned me there, and I understood that whatever came next would change all three of our lives. I didn't sleep much after that storm, not because of the thunder, but because of the way the creature had looked at me, steady, deliberate, as if measuring whether I was friend or foe. By morning, the air in the facility felt changed, charged with an invisible tension that traveled through metal floors and stale recycled air. She arrived early, her steps soft but purposeful, and when she approached the glass, the creature straightened with a quiet rumble of recognition. I watched from behind the observation panel, feeling something uneasy coil inside my chest, because devotion like that does not fall without consequence, and I sensed we were drifting toward a line none of us were meant to cross. Their communication grew more intricate as the days lengthened. She brought sketchboards, simple chalk, and small objects approved by the behavioral division. The creature mimicked her motions, tapping rhythms, drawing crude shapes, sometimes tracing the outline of her hand on the glass with surprising delicacy. His breathing slowed in her presence, deep and steady like an old forest settling after wind. More and more, I found myself lingering behind her, trying to decipher whether he understood her words or simply her kindness. But then she began reading to him, voice low and melodic, choosing tales about mountains, rivers, and migrations, and with each story, his eyes softened in ways that made the armed guard shift uncomfortably. The director noticed the shift long before he admitted it. He watched the footage with stiff shoulders and irritated breaths, muttering that we were compromising the integrity of the project. I knew what he meant. Creatures weren't meant to display dependence, and agents weren't meant to reciprocate it. One afternoon, he cornered me outside the containment wing, his voice low and cold, warning that her attachment would contaminate the research. I nodded, because agents nod when superiors speak, but inside I felt the words scrape against something raw. When I returned to the observation room, she was sitting cross-legged by the barrier, reading, and the creature lay curled near the glass like a giant listening child. It was a sight the director would never understand. Spring crept over mountains outside, though inside the facility, the seasons were flattened into identical hums of machinery. Still, the creature sensed a shift. He grew restless during mornings, pacing near the vent that carried smells of thawing soil from the outside world. When she entered, he stopped instantly, lowering himself into a posture that almost resembled greeting. She spoke to him in gentle cadences, guiding his breathing when anxiety tightened his movements. And he listened. I watched him across the control monitors, struck by how naturally she steadied him, how instinctively he responded, as if her voice bridged some ancient memory of safety he had buried long ago. Then came the day he tried to speak, not with words, but with a sound that hovered somewhere between a hum and a growl, shaped with intention rather than instinct. She froze, eyes wide, and answered with an encouraging whisper. He repeated the sound, softer this time, leaning close to the glass. It felt like witnessing the first spark of something evolutionary, something forbidden. I felt pride, but also dread, because the more he connected with her, the more fragile their world became. The director would soon take notice, and I suspected his response would not be gentle. That suspicion became certainty when the new behavioral protocols arrived. Stress tests designed to evaluate aggression thresholds. She read them with trembling hands, her jaw tightening as if each line carved deeper resentment into her bones. The creature sensed her distress before anyone else. He pressed his palm to the barrier, issuing a low, protective rumble that echoed down the hall. She ignored procedure, stepping closer, whispering reassurance despite the cameras. He calmed, but only barely, and when the director reviewed the footage later, his expression hardened in a way that made my stomach turn. The test began anyway. Bright lights, loud tones, sensory disruptions. Cruel designs meant to provoke fear. The creature endured them with only occasional flinches, but his eyes searched constantly for her, scanning the observation decks whenever the lights dimmed. The director saw neediness where I saw trust. When she protested, he dismissed her objections with a cold reminder of rank. Her face flushed with helpless anger, and I felt something inside me fracture, because I knew she was right, and I was too afraid to stand beside her. That night, I returned to containment wing long after the others had left. She was there too, sitting with her forehead resting against the glass, whispering frustrated promises that she would find a way to protect him. The creature inched closer, mirroring her posture, and for a moment the hallway lights flickered, leaving only the faint glow of the control monitors illuminating their silhouettes. The intimacy of that image unsettled me more than any danger he could pose. It wasn't romantic, no. It was something older, deeper, something born from loneliness meeting gentleness for the first time. The next morning, everything changed. The creature woke before lights on, sniffed the air, and began pacing aggressively, not toward the exit, but toward the observation deck where she usually stood. When she didn't appear on time, he struck the barrier once, not in rage but in panic. By the time she rushed in breathless, he had already clawed at his own chest in distress, leaving dark streaks along his fur. She spoke quickly, soothing him with steady murmurs, and he collapsed to his knees, trembling. I stepped forward instinctively, but he only watched her, clinging to every movement of her hands. Later, when the director reviewed the incident, he declared her presence a destabilizing variable. He ordered reduced contact. She stared at him as if he'd sentenced someone she loved. I didn't intervene. I didn't even speak. And that cowardice burned through me long after the meeting ended. That evening, she told me quietly that she wouldn't obey, that she couldn't abandon him after he had placed all his trust in her. Her voice shook, not with fear but with conviction, and in that trembling I realized how far things had already gone. I walked to the containment doors, my pulse riddled with dread, knowing the director would escalate soon. When she stepped inside and the creature rose to greet her, I saw something unmistakable pass between them, something the Bureau would never allow. And as I watched his massive hand lift toward her, I knew the moment of reckoning had begun. I felt the shift long before the alarms or the memos or the hushed conversations in the director's office. It was in the air itself, in the way the facility seemed to shrink around us, as if the walls sensed the bond growing stronger and wanted to tighten before it burst. By late 1995, rumors had leaked through the ranks like cold water. Higher command was reconsidering the creature's purpose. Words like unstable, transfer, and containment breach potential floated through corridors that used to echo with nothing more than footsteps and recycled air. I tried to keep my head down, to pretend the threat wasn't real, but every time I entered the observation hall and saw the creature rise the moment she appeared, I felt the truth gnawing at me. Something beautiful had formed between them, something dangerous. She felt the pressure too. I saw it in the way her fingers trembled when she adjusted her notes, in the way her voice steadied itself with effort when speaking to him, as if guarding him from the tension she carried. The creature sensed it better than either of us. His breathing quickened when unfamiliar personnel passed through the wing. He stood taller, shoulders rigid, massive hands hovering near the glass as though preparing to shield her at a moment's notice. It was not aggression. It was vigilance. And that vigilance terrified the director. The new tests were a cruel turning point. The director ordered a psychological assessment regimen that pushed every ethical boundary we had left. Loud bursts of sound, disorienting strobe lights, temperature shocks, the kind of stimuli designed to crack open primal instincts. She protested with a fury I had never seen in her, a trembling mixture of anger and fear that made even hardened agents avert their eyes. But her objections were dismissed. The director insisted the bond was skewing our data, that removing her influence was essential. The creature endured the first test with resilience, but the moment she rushed into the observation deck afterward, he slumped to the floor, exhausted, emitting a soft whimper that hollowed out my chest. During one evaluation, He pressed both palms against the barrier, searching the hallway for her. The moment she arrived, his entire body loosened as if shackles had fallen away. The director watched this on the monitor, expression blank but jaw tight. It was then I realized he feared not the creature's strength, but its loyalty. And loyalty, once established, is a force no cage can maintain. Then the blackout occurred. A storm rolled over the mountains, snarling the power grid and plunging the facility into darkness for nearly 6 minutes. In those minutes, we heard something I will never forget. The frantic pounding of the creature's fists against reinforced steel, echoing to the corridors like thunder trapped underground. When emergency lights flickered on, he wasn't trying to escape the building. He was trying to reach her office. He thought something had happened to her. He thought she was in danger. Security teams swarmed the wing, tranquilizer rifles raised, but she appeared at the far end of the hallway before they fired. She called out to him, her voice breaking through the chaos like a flare, and he froze, chest heaving. The guards sedated him anyway. She screamed at them, voice raw, but it didn't matter. Protocol had been triggered, and the director seized the incident as justification for isolation measures. When they dragged him back to confinement, limp and shuddering, I saw her drop to her knees as though she felt the needle in her own veins. In the hours that followed, something hardened inside her. She spent long moments staring at the footage, hands clenched, lips pressed tight. When I approached, she didn't look at me until she had steadied her breathing. She whispered that he had been afraid for her, not for himself, that he had risked everything to find her in the dark. And then she said something I hadn't expected. He shouldn't die in here. It wasn't a plea. It was a decision forming behind her ribs, a vow-gathering weight. I wanted to stop her. I wanted to remind her of the protocols, the dangers, the fact that we were federal agents bound by duty. But the words dried in my throat because I knew she was right. The creature had shown us more humanity than the men running the place. And I had watched that humanity be punished again and again. My silence made me complicit. That truth settled heavier on me each day, like sediment gathering at the bottom of a river. She started staying later, whispering to him through the glass when she thought no one was watching. I often stood down the corridor, pretended to check equipment, but really listening to the softness in her voice, the way he responded with small, rumbling vibrations that resonated through the walls. Their conversations had evolved beyond gestures. They had become a dialogue of breath, tone, and presence. They understood each other without needing words. And that understanding was the one thing the director couldn't control. When the transfer order arrived, a classified relocation to a black site with no return, I knew the final thread had snapped. She found me in the lab, holding the paper with both hands, as though afraid it might crumble. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she said they would kill him. Maybe not immediately, but inevitably. He's not a threat, she said, but he will be treated like one. I had no arguments left, only guilt. That night, she asked me a question that changed everything. She asked if I would help her get him out. The words hung in the stale air, dangerous and impossible, yet somehow inevitable. I stared at her, seeing not recklessness but desperate clarity, and felt the weight of years settle against my bones. I thought of the creature's eyes during the blackout, searching the corridors for her, and I knew that in his world, she was the only light left. I didn't answer with words. I just handed her my access card. She inhaled sharply, understanding the magnitude of what I'd done. Then she turned toward the containment wing, where the creature lay sedated and alone. And as I watched her walk away, heart pounding like a warning drum, I knew there was no turning back. The storm outside was beginning again, and something far more dangerous was coming with it. I remember the night we chose to betray the agency as vividly as I remember my own name. The storm outside roared like something ancient, shaking the facility's steel bones while alarms blinked nervously along the walls. She stood beside me, pale but resolute, clutching the card I'd given her. Neither of us spoke as we approached the containment wing, because words felt too fragile to carry the weight of what we were about to do. The creature sensed us before we reached the security door. His silhouette shifted, rising from the shadows like a wounded guardian answering a call. She pressed her palm against the glass, whispering his name with a tremor I had never heard before. He responded with soft, rumbling exhale, pressing his massive hand against the barrier, as if recognizing the urgency in her voice. I swiped the card, and the lock disengaged with hiss. The door opened slowly, heavy as guilt, and the creature stepped forward, towering but trembling. His wound from the previous sedation had not fully healed, yet he moved with desperate determination, keeping his gaze locked on her as though she were the only fixed point in a collapsing world tonight. We guided him through the dim corridor, his footsteps thudding softly like distant drums beneath the concrete. Pipes rattled overhead as the storm intensified, spraying mist that mixed with the creature's labored breaths. She walked ahead, whispering assurances over her shoulder, each word steadying him more than any tranquilizer could. When the first alarm sounded, my heart lurched, but she didn't stop. She turned to him, raising her hands, guiding him deeper into the facility's lower levels where emergency lighting flickered like dying embers. We could hear guards shouting above us, boots slamming against stairwells, the entire building waking panic. He stumbled once as a shockwave rattled the walls, but she steadied him with nothing more than her voice. It amazed me how quickly he responded, how deeply he trusted her in a world that had shown him only cruelty. His enormous frame shuddered with fear, yet he followed her. We reached the outer maintenance bay just as the backup generators engaged, flooding the hallway with harsh white light. His eyes narrowed, overwhelmed, and she shielded him with her body, though he towered above her like a mountain. For a moment he hesitated, sensing the danger gathering outside the security. I pulled the lever beside me, releasing the locks with a metallic groan that echoed through the bay. The storm's roar burst into the corridor, carrying cold rain and a wild scent of pine. He inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring, recognizing the smell of freedom like a memory clawing forward inside. But the moment he stepped toward the open air, a gunshot cracked through the storm. He jerked, stumbling as blood bloomed across his shoulder like dark fire. She screamed, rushing to him, and he turned, placing himself between her and the approaching guards with protective instinct that was human. He roared not in rage but in warning, a sound that vibrated through the storm-soaked trees beyond the bay. The guards hesitated, startled by the sheer depth of it, giving her just enough time to grab his arm and pull him toward the forest. I followed, heart pounding against mine. The forest swallowed us in darkness, branches whipping at our faces as mud sucked at our boots. He moved with surprising steadiness despite his wound, driven by something primal and pure. She stayed close to him, whispering breathless encouragement, each word sharp with fear and fierce determination as lightning split. We reached a ravine swollen with rain, its edges crumbling under the relentless storm. The bridge that once crossed it had collapsed, leaving only jagged logs and rushing water below. He hesitated, swaying, blood streaming down his arm like a dark river. She grabbed his hand, pleading with him to... He answered by lifting her gently, cradling her against his uninjured side, and leaping across the ravine in a single, desperate motion. The landing nearly broke him. He collapsed to one knee, wheezing, but kept her safe in his arms until she guided him under a fallen cedar offered. He slumped against a tree, breath ragged, eyes clouded with pain yet fixed on her face as though anchoring his fading strength. She pressed her hands against his wounds, her voice trembling as she begged him to hold on. I stood helplessly nearby, realizing we had crossed a now. The storm worsened, thunder cracking so close it shook loose bark from the cedar above us. He lifted his head weakly, brushing his knuckles against her cheek in a gesture so gentle it hollowed my chest. She caught his hand, tears mixing with rain, whispering that he wasn't allowed to. The guard shouts grew louder behind us, flashlights slicing to the dark in frantic arcs. He struggled to rise, refusing to let danger reach her, but his legs buckled beneath his weight. She held his face in both hands, urging him to stay with her, and for a moment he tried once more to rise, driven by instinct rather than strength, but his body swayed dangerously. She wrapped her arms around him, pressing her forehead to his as if willing her breath into his lungs. I stepped forward to help, but he released a faint growl, telling me without. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the sound of more agents closing in, their radios crackling like distant fire. She clutched the creature's shoulders, begging him to rise, but his limbs trembled uncontrollably. He looked at her, eyes soft despite the pain, and I knew he understood what was coming even. He lifted her one final time, not to flee, but to place her safely behind the cedar's thick roots, shielding her from the path of the oncoming rifles. When he turned back toward the lights, he stood taller than I'd ever seen him, as though preparing to face his fate. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.